Hello Revolution students, this video is devoted to Sun Yixian and the 1911 revolution, the double 10th revolution, which began on the 10th of October 1911, and it's called the double 10th revolution because it began on the 10th day of the 10th month of 1911. As you would be aware, you're studying the Chinese Revolution, AOS 1. The period this study covers is from 1912 to 1949, so 1912 being the early Republican era up to 1949 when the Kuomintang are defeated by the CCP in the Civil War. However, to understand this period, it's also important to understand what happened prior to it during this revolution and key causes of the revolution, such as, for example, Sun Yixian's three principles, his Sanminzhuyi. So that's why we're looking at this now. So let's get into it. We're going to begin with a just pretty much an overview of the causes of the 1911 revolution and then go from there. So the contributing factors to the 1911 revolution, there were many. The first one were the Qing Reforms. So the Qing dynasty, the Manchus, they had ruled China from 1644 and they were eventually overthrown in 1911. Near the end of their rule, at the start of the 20th century, a number of reforms have been put in place by the Qing in order to stop foreign encroachment, in order to modernize China, because they've realised belatedly that in order to defend themselves against the British and the French who were taking over or gaining greater control over China's economy through their treaty ports, places like Hong Kong and Shanghai and so forth, the Qing needed to modernise China to defend itself. So they implemented a number of reforms. These reforms included educational reforms, such as improving primary school education, military reforms, creating a modern army led by what were known as the new army officers, and they were actually Han Chinese rather than Manchus. The Qing were Manchu. And also economic reforms and so forth. So a number of and perhaps one of the most significant was some democratic reforms. The Qing actually set up provincial assemblies, and those assemblies debated various issues related to the provinces, which sort of opened up China to the practice of parliamentary democracy, or the sort of the beginning of it anyway. So they were the Qing reforms, and what those Qing reforms did was they certainly modernised China, but they also gave the Han Chinese an opportunity to voice their concerns, their grievances towards their Qing rulers in the provincial assemblies. It gave experience to Han leaders in running the provinces, and the military reforms put Han new army officers in positions of power within the military. So all of these things, although they contributed to modernising China, they also undermined the authority of the Qing within China. Next key factors that contributed to the 1911 revolution was this social and economic inequality. And the first one there you see poverty. So by the 1850s, the average life expectancy was around 25 years for Chinese. That meant that many people were dying at a very early age, and the causes of those deaths were poverty, famine, people not having enough to eat. And a key reason for that was that many peasants didn't have enough land to actually grow their crops upon. They didn't own their land. So 60% of the land in China, roughly around 60% of the land in China during, from the 1850s onwards, and it only increases. It gets up to 70% once we get into the mid 20th century, 1940s and 50s. But 60% of the land was owned by wealthy Chinese. absentee landlords who lived in places like Shanghai or provincial cities like Changsha, Hong Kong and so forth. And they owned the land and they rented that land out to poor peasants who were known as tenant farmers. So these poor peasants, they didn't even work, they didn't even own the land that they worked upon, they had to rent the land. So they grew crops on this rented land. Part of the crop they used to pay the rent. Another part of their crop they had to use for paying taxes, and whatever they had left, they fed their family. And if they had anything left after that, they maybe were able to sell it for a profit. But most could not. So there were regular famines and so forth, and this is a reason why why there was such a low average life expectancy of 25 years in China at the time. Other examples of social inequality were the treatment of women, and some of the most infamous, or perhaps the most infamous example of this was foot binding, where Han Chinese women had their feet bound at a very early age, 4 or 5 years old, so that their feet would look get all crunched and look very tiny and small, and that was seen as desirable. But it meant for these women who had their feet bound that they could not do any physical labour, they couldn't work in the fields, and they couldn't also, because they couldn't run, they had to titter along on their feet, they couldn't leave their families or run away from abusive husbands. So foot binding was a very common practice in China at this time. It was practiced by middle class and wealthy Han Chinese women, or imposed upon them. The Manchus did not practice this, Mongols didn't practice it either, so it was an exclusively Han Chinese custom. And poor Han Chinese women, they did not have their feet bound because they were needed to work in the fields. And then another example of social inequality were arranged marriages of women. So, young girls when they were 13, 14 years of age were they were placed in arranged marriages with older men. They had no choice. And then they served that man, and they served often their mother-in-law for the rest of their lives. So there was no freedom for them. So social and economic inequality, these grievances that they caused, was a key factor in the 1911 revolution. Another key factor in the revolution was Sun Yixian's revolutionary ideology, the 3 principles. In Mandarin, it's the Sanminzhuyi, 3 principles of the people, Sanminzhuyi. And this was Sun's revolutionary manifesto. It was what he set out, or his roadmap to creating a modern republican China, a modern society. It was a set of promises that he made to the Chinese people, and many Chinese people thought these promises were excellent. So the 3 principles, the first principle was nationalism. So end Qing rule and the domination of foreign imperialist powers in China. His key slogan was China is the China of the Chinese. So when he was saying China is the China of the Chinese, he was saying he wanted to end Qing rule, because the Qing, from his perspective, he was Han, were not Chinese, they were Manchu, so they were a foreign power who controlled China, and also get rid of the Western imperialist powers, so Britain and their control over places like Hong Kong and Shanghai and so forth, the Germans in Shandong province, etc. The next principle, the second principle, was democracy. So he envisaged that once the revolutionaries overthrew the Qing, that they would create a parliamentary democratic republic. He realised, though, that because the Chinese had no experience of democracy, that democracy would have to be introduced by stages, because he feared if that didn't occur, then it would not remain in China. Democracy would be overthrown, and replaced perhaps by another dynasty, another emperor or empress. So these stages included, firstly, he believed it was important, once the revolutionaries got into power, to have a 3 years of military dictatorship. He recognised that a military dictator had the authority to impose republican or revolutionary rule within China and stop China from breaking up into a number of independent provinces and warring states, which had happened in Chinese history a number of times when one dynasty was overthrown by another. So he wanted to avoid disunity in China. He thought in order to do this, you needed a strong military dictator. Then the next stage, once you'd had this 3 years of military dictatorship, then there would be 6 years of educating Chinese about democratic procedures and trialling these procedures, almost like democracy with training wheels on. So educating Chinese and how democracy worked, having, for example, going back to these provincial assemblies and getting them to debate or implement social reforms at a provincial level. And then once the Chinese were used to it and they understood how democracy worked, only then would elections be held after the 9 years and a new constitution drawn up. So they were his the stages that he set for introducing democracy in China. These stages are important to understand when we look at later events from 1912 onwards, and to understand his reasons why he, although he was elected or made provisional president very early on, which we're going to look at in a sec, the reason why he was quite prepared to actually give that provisional presidency up to Yuan Shikai, who was the commander-in-chief of the Qing forces, because Sun saw Yuan Shikai as this strong military dictator that was needed to have stability in China. The final principle was people's livelihood, and this was a form of Sinai socialism. And what it involved was regulating ownership of land redistribution, so taking land away from these wealthy Chinese landowners and distributing it to poorer Chinese, so that the majority of Chinese have enough land to live on and grow the food they need. The other key aspect of people's livelihood was a fairer tax system, so that the poor and the masses didn't pay more tax than they could adequately actually do without sinking into poverty more, as well as more government ownership of industry. Sun had studied Marxism in his travels overseas, and even though he'd studied Marxism, he realised he believed it wasn't applicable to China. But he thought people's livelihood, this was his, I suppose, Sinicized form of Marxism. Okay, next. Another key contributing factor to the 1911 revolution was the Tongmenghui, also known as a revolutionary alliance, translated to. So this was Sun Yixian's revolutionary group that he'd set up, and it staged, prior to the October 1911 revolution, a number of failed uprisings and insurrections. But a key contribution of the Tongmenghui was that they popularised the idea that revolution, or the overthrow of the Qing, was necessary to modernise China. So Sun didn't believe that you could still have the Qing in power. You couldn't have, like, for example, a constitutional monarchy where you had the Qing emperor still having being emperor and having a parliament beneath him, okay, or an empress and having a parliament working together. He didn't believe that was possible. The only way to modernise China, the only way to get rid of Western imperial control over parts of China, was to have a republic, was to overthrow the imperial system totally. So those were the contributing factors, the main contributing factors to the 1911 revolution. The revolution itself started, it wasn't planned, it was a spontaneous revolution. It began with an accidental bomb exploding in Wuhan on the 10th of October 1911, and this bomb was being constructed by new army officers. When it exploded, the new army officers realised, they feared they would get arrested, so they started an insurrection in Wuhan, and that insurrection quickly spread from Wuhan throughout the south. As you can see there, the rebel leaders were primarily new army officers working with delegates of the provincial assemblies. So there's politicians in, delegates in the provincial assemblies. And the mutiny quickly spread, so within 6 weeks, 15 of China's 24 provinces declared their independence from Qing rule. Most of those, if not all of those provinces, were to the south of, or in southern China, below the Yangtze River. On the 29th of December 1911, Sun Yixian was made provisional president by 16 provincial assemblies. So he was pretty much going to be, from that point, the new president of China. However, there was an issue. Even though the South had gone over to the revolution, the North was still strongly held by Qing forces, and those Qing forces were under the command of Yuan Shikai, who had been made commander-in-chief of the Qing forces by Emperor Puyi, or the Regency Council anyway, that controlled things in Beijing. So you had these two forces. You had Sun in the south, Yuan Shikai with his Qing forces in the north. Sun he did not want to have a war of control to try to fight the north, and Yuan Shikai was actually on a similar page, so they came to an agreement. They made an agreement, and Sun said, I will give up he said up to Yuan Shikai, I will give up the presidency if you ally yourself with the South. And Yuan said, yes, we'll do that. And I will, I'll take the presidency. And another part of the agreement, I also want the capital. Yuan Shikai said this. This is what Yuan Shikai wanted. He wanted the capital in Beijing rather than Nanjing, because in Beijing, that was Yuan Shikai's power base. Sun agreed to this. And then, as a consequence, Yuan Shikai convinced Puyi, the emperor, who was, I think he was about 9 years old at the time, to abdicate, or those who were in the Regency Council, to make him abdicate. And Emperor Puyi abdicated on the 12th of February 1912, and then shortly after, Yuan Shikai became president on the 10th of March 1912. So, and then that leads into this early Republican era where our course begins for China AOS1. And Yuan Shikai remains president up until 1916. And from there on, a number of various things prop up. But we'll get to that in our next video. So anyway, I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope will be useful for your study of China Area of Study 1. Thank you very much.